Hello, everyone, and welcome to Wolfed, a podcast for engineering leaders and those aspiring to deliver products and outcomes that matter. I'm your host, Christopher Cohen, and today I'm excited to conclude season one of Wolfed with special guest Lisa Hornschemeier, the Vice President of Engineering for the Oracle Cloud Infrastructure. In today's episode, Lisa will talk with us about her thrilling career journey from pre-med student at Miami University to leadership roles at GE, Microsoft, and of course, Oracle. We'll also cover the leadership philosophy behind her team's customer-centric approach to product development. She'll provide her take on the ideals versus business realities of DevOps, and we'll close out the conversation by getting her perspective on being a working mother and how to overcome unconscious bias in the workplace through grassroots efforts. Lisa's career is full of rich experiences and great nuggets of wisdom, and just as compelling is her engaging and relatable personality. Her enthusiasm for what she does is infectious. Let's get this conversation started. Today, our guest is a distinguished engineering leader currently serving as the Vice President of Software Engineering at Oracle, where she runs engineering and operations for subscription plan management, tenancy level management, and account platform services for Oracle Cloud Infrastructure. With a robust career, not just at Oracle, but also Microsoft and GE, she's driven innovation in multiple disciplines throughout her illustrious career. So join us as we explore the insights and experiences of this accomplished tech visionary. It's Lisa Hornschemeier. Hello, Lisa. Thank you for joining us today.
Hello, Chris. Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. And so usually when we get started here, I'm always very, very curious to sort of hear, like, what was it in your path that sort of made you to decide that you're going to pursue software engineering as a career path?
So are we dating myself all the way back to my college years, or because that's where it did start? So to be quite frank, I was pre-med. I wanted to be a doctor my entire life. And when I went away to college in my first year in college at Miami University, part of the liberal arts program, you are recommended to a variety of different classes that are outside of your major. And I came across a programming class because I wanted to run a doctor's office one day, my own business. And so I figured I'm going to have to figure out how to run systems in the office. And then I found my love of programming and computer programming, specifically Java. I loved Java development in college. And I guess where that led me down the path of, I said, ew, I don't want to go to med school. I want to make money and I want to develop software. So I kind of found my way through that vehicle of liberal arts program at college at Miami University.
I mean, was that a big shift? Were you deep into your pre-med classes, or was it pretty early on where you were able to pivot pretty easily?
So it was after my freshman year. So I was taking chemistry and zoology, biology, all of the fun pre-med weed out classes. But it wasn't a huge shift because I've always been a science and math nerd at heart growing up in high school. I've, STEM discipline, science and being a doctor. Those are kind of my subjects and academics that I loved. And computer programming, specifically MIS major at Miami, was a kind of a combination of science, math, as well as business classes. So business became a new kind of forte for me. It was a little bit of a shift. But I went with it and I loved programming. I love math and science. And so it just stuck with me.
And so was this truly like in college, this is your first time writing code on a keyboard, or had you had any exposure prior?
I was not a gamer. My parents, we bought a computer when I was in eighth grade and it was AOL dial up. And I'm like, oh, chat rooms. But that was like about it. In high school, I was very science focused and math focused. I didn't take any business classes or really software engineering classes. So it was my very first introduction and I went with it. I loved it. I ended up being a COBOL lab aide because I knew COBOL programming, mainframe programming. And I ended up after the semester taking that class, the professor was like, hey, do you want to be the lab aide next semester for the next class? Because I just loved, I loved programming and I loved debugging. So I ended up doing that. And then I found my way. I started taking C++ and Java and all the different courses that tack on to that. It's just, I kept going with it. It was easy. And, as humans, when you do something hard and it comes easy to you and you're doing it and it's something hard a lot of people don't understand, but it becomes really easy for you, you automatically are like, oh my gosh, I got to keep doing this. This is a big deal. And so that's kind of how I kept going with it.
And so I guess as an aide too, that you probably had a early opportunity to work with other students and to sort of maybe I don't know if we want to describe it as mentorship, but certainly some guidance there. Did you have any inkling at that point that like, hey, maybe not just engineering, but engineering leadership might be in my future, or was that off your radar?
I mean, I played competitive basketball growing up. I wanted to be the team captain, so sports leadership was something that I naturally gravitated towards. So, I've grown up where people have shared with me, you're kind of a leader. You are a leader. So, in the C++ and the Java classes, I ended up being kind of assistants in the class to help people get through their programming assignments so they can actually be complete before the end of the class.
Right.
Professors were totally fine with that. I just gravitate more towards that. I don't really know at 18 and 19 if I was necessarily thinking I'm going to be a leader. At that
Sure.
point, I was just loving what I was doing and I wanted to help other people do well with it as well.
I think very few engineers sort of have it in mind early on that like specifically engineering leadership is in my career path. It's more something that happens as a gradual evolution. So I wonder for you, Lisa, like, as I mentioned earlier, you've worked at these massive corporations like GE and Microsoft and now Oracle. What was this transition for you like as you're working as an IC and slowly we're getting into these leadership roles? How did that play out for you? How did that opportunity first arise?
So becoming a first time manager, I think it was about maybe 5 years into my GE experience, and that was an impressionable period because going from an individual contributor into a frontline manager, you have to work differently, and your goals are different, and you actually are. It's about your team, and it no longer becomes independently about you selfishly yourself anymore. And so there is a transition. Um, I would say in the organization that I worked in, I was pretty fungible. I moved around and to different teams, learning different areas. And so I believe from an optics standpoint, leaders were recognizing that I was able to develop breadth of scope and be able to jump into new areas and be productive fairly quickly. And I think they, noticed that. They actually asked me to consider a frontline manager position, and I didn't necessarily go after it. I was still heads down, just doing what people are telling me to do and loving what I'm doing and learning new things as I go. And I would say, I was like, yeah, they asked me to do something. I'm ready to try something new. And so I jumped into that leadership role. It was, I had great support. I would say, anyone moving from an IC into a first time manager role, it's really important for that person before they make that decision to really understand if they think they'll have the right leadership support on that. My boss at the time was a great mentor and a great coach and sponsor in general. And so she was very supportive in sharing with me, this is how you're going to have to work and this is why it's going to feel different and look different. And she was just a great mentor on top of being my actual boss at the time. I would say a very parallel, similar pattern existed when I became for the first time a manager of managers, which
Mhm.
was when I moved into my role at Microsoft. So I left a management role at GE and my teams got bigger in size, but I wasn't at GE a manager of managers. So when I jumped into my
Right.
Microsoft role, it was also a little bit of a change. And I would say it was a little bit more difficult because it was a new company. I didn't have the systems and support structures. I had to establish myself and I had to figure out how I had to work differently than what I was used to because I became a leader of leaders versus a manager of
Right.
ICs.
Yeah, I wonder that, how you compare those transitions. And I know you're saying that there are different variables in place because at one, you were a company you were already familiar with, you had a support network versus going somewhere brand new. But
Yeah.
still, I imagine that transition from being an IC to being a manager of ICs, you've probably got a lot where you're trying to change your mindset from, kind of, as you said, it's almost now a team sport again, right? So how does that compare, that leap versus now you're a manager of ICs going to being a manager of managers? If you compare and contrast, what do you think stands out to you?
So I would say the similarity is what's the same is when you move from an IC to a first time manager or a manager of ICs into a manager of leaders, you really have to take a step back. You're developing people in both roles, and those needs are different, but you're still developing people. So we all achieve success as aspiring ICs based on our own independent value that we contribute and the outcomes that we are delivering. And we can, and we're responsible for controlling our destiny. So when you move into a manager role, your destiny becomes the success of other people. And in order for them to learn, they're going to have to know how to work and how they transcend successfully. And you, as a leader, can't do the work for them, which is what you're going to instinctively think you're on autopilot doing. My boss gives me some certain instruction, and now I have to share it with my team. And so you have to be very careful that you're not being super prescriptive or you're doing all the
Mm,
work for your people because you have to develop people into their own leaders as well. And so it can be it's a little bit of a change where you're more instinctively wired to control what you need to do, and then how you work as a manager becomes okay, I might have the answer, but what's more important is if I'm guiding the discussion so that way the folks that work for me, they figure out the answer on their own and I've enabled them to find that. Because then that's the magic, right? We can't or we become
right.
a bottleneck and not as effective as we should. Same thing when you become a manager of leaders, right? The scope and responsibility of your leaders is bigger than an IC, but you're still developing them to be bigger leaders.
That makes sense. Basically, fostering an environment where these folks are able to sort of then take the reins beyond that, and like you're saying, otherwise you sort of get to a point where there's this funnel that we can't get past because
Mhm.
everything has to go through one individual. So we have to cultivate an atmosphere of, well, it's almost you remind me, it's almost like therapy. You have to lead someone to be able to help themselves.
Therapy kind of blends in. I almost wonder sometimes, honestly, I was just joking with my boss the other day. I'm like, gosh, I wish I had a psych degree and I can like mesh into this world of business because I feel like that would be super valuable right now.
I bet. Something that stood out to me, Lisa, but when on a couple of our previous calls is you seem to have a lot of really interesting insights into building, team building and really building diverse teams. One idea that you mentioned, I really loved how you phrased this, is this idea of winning in scarcity, and really just the
Mhm.
idea of like, how do we do more with less? How do we achieve more with less? So as an engineering leader, we're often in this position where it's like, okay, we've got certain time frames, very considerable constraints on how we're going to deliver it in a very strict timeline. So as a leader, how do you determine which projects to prioritize, which initiatives to prioritize? What does that look like for you?
So I mean, I feel like largely it's the same wherever you work. At the end of the day, we're all a business. We're all trying to make money. It's a lot of economics. And I think sometimes as engineers, we lose sight to context around economics that drives the right prioritization. And what I mean specifically on that is if I'm in the business of, we're all in the business of making money. So we're creating products, systems, and services for our customers, and we want to make money. And in order to make money and protect margins, we want to do that the cheapest way possible, but have the highest of quality so our customers are happy. I would say, I'm constantly faced, in my current role today and in previous roles at other companies where you're asked to do more than you can deliver, than you have capacity for. And not all the time your leaders are micromanaging, hopefully not micromanaging everything they're asking you to do because they're actually trying to figure out other issues. And so you become responsible to synthesizing all the demands coming into your team, and then taking a step back, zooming out, and trying to determine, okay, what what should we be doing? Where are we going to make money? Where are the customers facing pain points? Where are the customers need enhancements of their products? So focusing on customer experience is typically what I try to prioritize, as well as revenue generating opportunities. So, where we're going to be able to create revenue, new revenue, increased revenue, and where we're able to enhance a customer experience, which typically then helps more revenue later, right? That's how I prioritize work. We have a huge backlog. And even when I was at GE, at Microsoft, and now at Oracle, the backlog is constant where you have a ton of opportunities to drive more efficient and more optimized patterns in your systems, which is engineering, I'll say, excellence. It doesn't necessarily help a customer, or it doesn't necessarily increase revenue, but it optimizes your architecture. All of that typically tends to go behind customer demands and revenue generating opportunities. So the complexity and the hard part of leadership is trying to figure out what items you bring in, and you weave those into the other priorities, because you can't completely ignore optimizing your architecture, or that's going to lead to major issues down the road. And you're not
Mhm.
going to be able to run things as efficiently. So that's kind of the blend. Usually it's customer first, revenue generating, and then you try to weave in, when you can, cycle to cycle, program cycle to program cycle, where you have optimization, where you're keeping your systems healthy.
You're raising a really good point, which is that, like, customer first, right? Like that's ultimately where, as you said, we're trying to drive revenue. That's where the revenue comes from. But there's often sort of this siloing between, certainly at an IC level, engineers and the customer. And I wonder for you, Lisa, like, where is the responsibility in terms of being very connected with the customer? Is it possible to foster that at an IC level? Is it a manager's job? Is it a director's job, or all the way up to the higher echelons, like where you are now? How do we keep an engineering team very in tune with what a customer needs, and how do we deliver that?
Yes. I'm going to play back to you, but I want to kind of set the playing field. When we say customer,
Sure.
Um, I am specifically talking about a paying customer to the company. So some people have a
Hmm.
different perspective of customer, where they think that the typical customer externally, as well as internal customers. I do think that there is a delineation that I've learned over time. In the inside of a company, I believe those are we're all partners. So they're all business partners or engineering partners or stakeholders. They're not necessarily customers. Um, Customers, when I talk customer and customer first, I'm meaning the revenue generating opportunities, the reason why we are a company and we are in business. So when we
Hmm.
talk about customers in that context, um, I believe, and so I've seen this, the maturity at companies is different. I think where companies have more maturity in product development, so they actually have organizations and teams that are studying customer behavior. And I anything from as parochial as, what are the customers clicking? How are they interacting with our systems and services? What and then on top of, are we having customer feedback sessions? Are we actually sitting down and sponsoring certain key customers and hearing from them their pain points or their experiences, and getting ideas for what we need to do next? That's a lot of product management. And where companies
Hmm.
invest in that as a discipline, and have people studying the different facets of the customer, I believe is where engineers at that same company are interacting with this organization, and they're hearing firsthand what the customer is saying, hearing, doing, feeling. Where you have companies that have maybe not as matured organizations of product management, I do think the engineers get more insulated, and
Mm.
and could potentially lose contact or context on what's important for the customer. And not every company has the maturity of product development. I understand that as well. If you're a small company, it's probably everyone's interacting with the customer. So there's that benefit. But if you're a larger company with more of not that discipline that's matured, I think it becomes the leaders to prioritize trying to understand and keep customer at the forefront as they're directing their teams. That's where that can be tricky. But if you have a strong product management function, and we do an OCI for sure, product inbound, product outbound, and if you have an organization that is super focused, hyper focused on that, the engineers, there's no excuse for engineers to lose touch of reality on what the customer needs, because you are making that interior and those requirements inside, and there's full lines of communication going on.
That's a really excellent delineation. I appreciate that perspective very much. Just to circle back for a second, you mentioned that I was going to say often, but probably always, there's more on our plates than is feasible to accomplish in a given stretch of
Yes.
time. And certainly at any echelon of leadership, we're feeling that pressure. But of course, it trickles down to the ICs as well. So when it comes to an atmosphere where we've got that pressure and we've got those, certain unattainable deadlines, how do we ensure that team members feel supported, feel empowered, can
Mhm.
excel in an environment where ultimately we're resource constrained and not everything can get done?
We're constantly facing this, and I do think that it becomes a leadership responsibility to understand where the capacity is constrained, what the priorities are, and to ensure there's alignment with leadership managing up, that we're working on the right things. And what I'll say, what's below the line or what's going to be in the backlog later, that's going to be addressed later, that everyone is, it's just full transparency. So that way there's less need to protect the team, because we're all bought in and on the same page for where our capacity is, where we're constrained, the priorities are in place, and what the commits are. I do think that that is not an IC responsibility. I think that is where the magic and responsibility comes into leadership and management.
Mm.
Every service team is constrained with capacity, right? It goes back to economics. We get asked more to do more than we can, and so it becomes leadership and management responsibility to understand what capacity is available, where are the priorities, and are we all fully aligned on this being, and I'm saying forced ranked lists of here's what I'm being asked to do, here's what I'm proposing are the priorities in forced ranked order based on what you have asked me to do you agree? Oh, okay, then you horse trade, like they know something. And you always have to rely on as you move up in a company, that leaders know more than you because they have more visibility than what you have. So you're relying on those needs. Then you sit down and you say, okay, this is the list. Do you do the horse trading? Everyone gets on the same page. This is the right list. And then you address commits based on timeline. Here's where my capacity is needed, and here's how much engineers it's going to take to do each one. And then here's the timing of when we're going to deliver it. And as long as you're communicating that and you're driving alignment and you're being transparent, there's really no need to protect anyone, because everyone's on the same page. Everyone's protecting each other because this is the playbook and we're all aligned and this is the right thing that we're doing. And here's the timing of when you can expect it to be delivered. That's how I roll.
That's beautiful. I love that a lot. And I wonder, like on the flip side, do you feel that there would be something lost if we weren't under this kind of pressure? I mean, is there a certain amount of innovation that is actually cultivated by this sort of environment
Totally.
that maybe we
I Yes, I think economics are set up this way where we should always be operating in scarcity, because we're always challenged to go after what we absolutely should be doing, rather than the nice to have, or I'm constantly
right?
iterating on something and you're not really using it yet you keep telling me to go develop more. And I do think that this beauty of this tug and pull relationship of economics, where I'm asked to do more than I can, forces us to get super focused, hyper focused, and really aligned on what's important. And honestly, it happens all the time. The things that get pushed down the list, not all the time, but some of them are always at the bottom of the list all the time, until we just finally say, we're not going to do this. And if we
Right.
weren't forced to operate with constraints and in scarcity, I might have picked that to do right away at the very beginning because I have all this unlimited capacity. And then I'm wasting money, I'm wasting time, and I'm doing things that
Mm.
probably aren't a priority.
I think it's always important to keep that in mind because it's almost sometimes feels like a relief to know that it's like, well, this forces a certain level of shrewd decision making that I think ultimately benefits the company, benefits the customer, everybody, right?
Yes, I think where we mess up, where it gets hard,
Okay.
is when we say no and we don't say why. I think that's what people get allergically react to. So if you want need me to
Mm.
do something and I don't have the capacity, and I say no, and then you start questioning, well, you think it's important. I mean, somebody's asking me to do something because they think it's important, right? So if we don't sit here and iterate on thought of, okay, are we thinking about this correctly? Is this in the right way? And then here's, if you want me to do this, here's what I'm going to move out if we're going to do this. Are we all on the same page? Right? It's this relationship that needs to come into the conversation in the context of the ask. I think where we fall short at times is when we're constantly getting these demands and we're just saying no to them. And I feel
Mm.
like that shuts down the right conversation because some of those no's should be yeses and some of those no's need to stay as no's, as long as we're all on the same page, though.
That makes sense. Something else, Lisa, that you brought up when we were chatting earlier is quite a unique take, I thought, on sort of just the concept of DevOps as a whole. And obviously, DevOps, it often gets championed as this technical philosophy aimed at breaking down silos between development and operations teams. But you mentioned that, well, the reality of this often differs from this idealized concept that I think we all have in our heads, or that maybe you write in a textbook. So I wonder if you might elaborate for us on some of the more common discrepancies you've observed between this academic definition of DevOps versus its implementation in real world engineering cultures.
I love this one. I think DevOps in the purest sense is beautifully academic. And what I mean by that is in a textbook, how it's written without the irrational human people element and how we run companies, I think it makes beautiful sense. I think it's a north star of a culture of how teams should form, storm, and norm. I don't believe that there is one. It's very academic and philosophical, and I think different companies, I don't want to say implement it differently, but are on it, have versions of it that work that might not be as uniformly practiced across every company. And I think that's okay. But I'll stop talking in generalities and I'll talk maybe more specifically. DevOps, if you just get to the crux of it, it's you have the same engineer that's developing features is also supporting the features or the service. And that most beautiful, purest academic sense, that is awesome. That is utopia. Because in theory, if I'm supporting what I'm building things smarter, right? I mean, that's the goal. Then you have reality that comes into play. And the reality is operations requires a skill set that is cheaper than maybe system engineering and development when it comes to certain complexity of programs and services. So then when you have economics of comp and bend structures of your workforce, and you try to look at how you can run things better and cheaper without quality taking a hit, sometimes you start to develop different practices where you can isolate more central ops skills that are cheaper for maybe, let's call it, very sensitive or very important tier zero services that have a lot of ops oversight is just needed. Do you really want to have PhD engineers that are extremely skilled in distributed engineering architecture, developing very, very aggressive, complex features? Also, once a month for a week, sitting and managing ops on certain dashboards that are looking at P&A and hygiene metrics. So you kind of get reality that blends into it. And how do I optimize? How do I
Hmm.
cultivate the spirit and intent of DevOps? I want my engineers to be smarter when they develop. So they need to be more aware and understanding of operational issues and how the services and the platform is running. But at the same point in time, how can I make sure my most skilled labor is doing the most critical work, and where can I manage more economics where it comes into lower value high touch tasks. So you're blending in economics with that economic purity, and I think you get different versions of it at different companies. And I do think that the different systems and structures, so like at Oracle we have this very kappa ops excellence driven culture where everyone participates in a lot. Like Microsoft called it live site. We call it Kappa events where there's an incident and a certain level of the incident that a large number of the engineers on the platform and service come in and 7 why did this happen, what can we do differently, and it's learning events. And you kind of bring that ops view and education in to a more broader sense of engineering. So you're keeping your engineers informed around the operations of your platform and systems, which to me is a version of DevOps.
Absolutely. So I wonder if you ultimately think, like you mentioned, that this idealized version of DevOps is sort of this North Star. Is that still worth having a sort of like this beautiful, as you described it, utopian sense that we're striving for? Or should organizations be a little bit more realistic about like the practical, grounded sense of the concept, and sort of strive for, well, this idea that we have written down, it's never something we're going to attain, and instead we should be shooting for really what it looks like practically.
Well, I think every company has a grouping of people that can develop a different point of view around the academic profile of what DevOps means. I don't think that there's a one size fits all template. I think that each company, depending on how it wants to differentiate itself and where its superpowers are based on the talent that they have and the products that they're developing, I think companies can iterate on how they implement DevOps, and that it doesn't need to be uniform. And I do think DevOps drives a certain philosophical perspective that makes sense. It's just how you implement it. I'm not quite sure is there's always a right way or there's always a wrong way. I think it's the beauty of how companies are structured, the people that work within them and what the superpowers are, and how those templates of DevOps grow up and work in their culture.
And that's actually a perfect transition too, because I was going to ask you about this. I know that you had also mentioned something earlier on in our call about bringing together the right group of people for team building, and really like leaning into people's superpowers, identifying those, and working to build the right team climate. I mean, it's a very difficult thing to do. It takes a lot of skills, including communication, transparency, support, a people first approach. So for you, Lisa, who has been successful in bringing together these kinds of really well cohesive teams, can you share some specific strategies or practices you've implemented to foster these elements within your teams?
Yeah, so and I don't know if it's like a Lisa thing, but some approaches that I've taken, or maybe some principles that I practice that are important that I think continue to work, that I continue carrying in my career. The people first. So there's this philosophy of, from a leadership standpoint, I feel like the trend, it's a trend and it changes. The pendulum swings back and forth. But there's one philosophical perspective that we should develop talent based on strength finding, right? And then there's this other philosophical dimension of, we need to develop talent by understanding development areas and what's holding them back, so that way we can help grow talent so they can be better than they were before. So one focuses on strengths, one focuses on development areas. I tend to I have an opinion and I have a preference of the strength finding. That doesn't mean that I'm like, hey, we don't have to talk about what you're not good at. But it means that if we're all here to make money and we're all working towards a common goal for the company, we all want to capitalize on our strengths. And so, what are your strengths? What are my strengths? What is his strengths and her strengths? And are we all aligned to make each other as a team work at a more accelerated pace? And the only way to do that is if we really create space and appreciate and acknowledge the strengths in all of us and where we can divide and conquer to do better. And I that's what I'm constantly trying to observe, study, and learn my about my team, each member on my team, what they're really good at, what they're not good at. And I want to make sure I'm aligning what people can do and what they're good at with what we have to get done. And then developing talent is if we're all aligned on what our superpowers are, that means that we're probably a lot happier, right? Like if I'm good at something and I get to do that, I'm probably going to be more satisfied as well. Because it's uncomfortable doing like being tied up with something that I know I'm not good at, right? But we have to do it. It's vulnerable. We have to do it at times. But then the talent management comes in along the way. In order for each
Mm.
person to get better, they're going to have to grow. So we are harnessing their strengths, and then we become aware of where they need to grow and what their development areas are that they're going to need to practice if they want to continue, their career and accelerating it at different levels. So I like to study my team. I like to get to know my team. I like to observe. I like to understand what people are good at, and I like to marry their talents with what they're good at and what's asked of us. That's always my goal. That's my people first. And then obviously, here's another one. I got to throw it out there. I like to have fun. Work is work family, right? Like personal is family. Like we spend a lot of time together. So I like to have healthy relationships at work. I like, if people want to share a little bit of their personal side in terms of what they like or what's going on in their life, I think those connections, should somebody want to share those with me, I think develops a different foundation of trust, which I think is very, very important for all of us from a relationship standpoint. So those are kind of
That's
my themes of what I feel like has helped me throughout the years.
ultimately, if not only is it fun to focus on the things that you're good at, but if we really only focus on our weaknesses, we're going to create a team of very average people. It's part of the equation, but we want to specialize in what makes somebody superpowered or special. That's wonderful. Something that I want to make sure that we touch on, because this is something that's quite unique to you, Lisa, as a woman in a leadership role within the tech industry. I'm sure there have been many unique challenges that you faced. What have these looked like? How have you overcome them? How have you reached, and it's such a broad question to say it this way, but how have you reached the heights that you've reached in engineering leadership despite those challenges?
It's a good question. Women, and I fall into this category too. I think we're pulled personally and professionally in two completely different directions. And I think we're constantly facing challenges, and whether that's society and the conditioning of how it's supposed to be, or it's our own personal agendas on how our values and culture are, and it's very personal to everyone. But there's a common theme, that's there, where, how can I be successful at work at the same time while I'm successful at home as a mother or a wife? And both require, I mean, we can't be in two places at once. At least I haven't figured that out completely yet. But when I do, we could have another podcast. It's a balance, and creating comfort in how you balance priorities at home on top of being present when you need to go to work and balance being present at work, I think is something that I don't know if I get it right all the time, and I don't know if women get it right all the time, but we want to be in both places and prioritize both. And I think that's a personal journey that each person needs to figure out and understand. And the balance, work life balance, I think is a balancing act that is unique to every single woman out there based on how her career is and how her home life is. Now, me personally, I wanted both. And so I figured out a balance that worked for me in my home front where I could do both. That required me to let go of some control at home. And so I could be more involved at work. And that also required me to elegantly maneuver boundaries at work where I could also be present at home the times I need to be present at
Mm.
home. And so what I mean by that is in the I have 4 kids. In the evenings, my kid time. We're highly active in a lot of sports. I like to be involved in their community so I can continue to stay engaged and be a good connecting mom with my kids and be present. That requires me sometimes to create certain boundaries around when I'm accessible, when I'm not at work. Also, at the same point in time, relinquishing control at home. So, I outsource food at times. I have a sitter on certain days of the week that helps me with running around with the kids if I can't get home at a certain time. It's a balance, so it's not all the time, but those are those areas where I think women struggle because there's not a one size fits all. There's not a playbook that tells us, okay, if you want to be an engineering leader and you want to be a mom, here's how you do it. And I think that's something that we're all trying to figure out. I think when it
Mm.
comes to women in tech and women in engineering roles, and I think what some of the challenges of that and from a career standpoint is we work differently. It has nothing to do women versus men and who's smarter or who's more intellectual. Honestly, that's not a gender question. That is what does your academic profile look like? How are your job experiences? That it has nothing to do with gender. But I do think that there's a lot of just unconscious bias that exists both with women and with men around being comfortable with what's familiar. And when
Mm.
you get into higher levels of leadership, trust and rapport become very important to your success as a leader because that means you have established trust with your peers and people know you, people are comfortable with you, you have rapport. And I think it's just human nature for all of us to connect with those that we feel comfortable with, and those that we feel comfortable with are familiar to us. And so when you sit at a
Mm.
table where there are 10 men and Lisa, I'm an outlier. And so I'm a little bit of like, you're probably going to be more comfortable with other people around the table unless we establish the right level of connection. So, again, this is why it's very important as women being somewhat still an outlier for just because of just gender differences, making sure
Mhm.
that we invest in connections and we build rapport, we establish trust. And then in return, our peers, and if they're a majority of men, is being willing to engage and be open and understand the unconscious bias and make it conscious of, hey, like, I tend to always go to these 4 guys all the time for questions and help and support. Maybe I will open up a new line of communication with Lisa. It's on both sides, and I think that's some of the struggles women experience is because we have to try a little bit harder to establish those connections and those on roads because we are still somewhat of an outlier in the workforce at high levels.
Definitely. I wonder specifically when it comes to those boundaries that you mentioned, how much of this would you say is the individual's responsibility to set these boundaries and to find that, that balance that you spoke of versus how much of this falls on each organization to allow for this kind of flexibility and allow for even maybe beyond a gender question, but for each individual to strike this balance for their own lives?
I so unfortunately, I don't know if people will agree with this, but I guess I'm not here to create fans. I'm here to just share my opinion. I believe the bigger weight and onus is on the individual. And unfortunately, if women are the minority, women need to be willing to put forth if they want to change that need to be willing to put forth more effort into breaking that pattern. But that doesn't completely exclude the system from having a responsibility in return either. So I feel like women, there is an important responsibility that we have where we are, and I believe we can take it on to face it, but then the supporting system and structures, this is not a company, like, I'm not looking for company policies. This isn't even C-suite leaders saying, like, let's try to get more visibility for women. Like, honestly, all that's kind of propaganda. That's not helping. It's a grassroots effort. So it's every male I see. It's every male frontline manager acknowledging that there could be an unconscious bias here, and I'm going to do a little bit more at my level to make sure I'm creating space for, somebody else to have an opinion, and I want to make sure that that's equal across the board. I think it's a grassroots from a system standpoint, but I do believe women have a responsibility, recognizing we are the outliers, that we're going to have to show up with a little bit more gusto to be able to, in order to break the pattern.
Hmm. How much of this issue do you think is, systemic in the sense that, like, how early can we start to support this idea that, even outside of leadership roles, just women in tech fields is an
Yeah.
underrepresented, they're a minority at this point. Like, what can we be doing to encourage, support more women to pursue and thrive in tech roles and, of course, tech leadership roles?
I think it starts in the classrooms. I'll go back to a very specific personal example. So my oldest daughter, who's now going to be 14, she was in kindergarten. And when she was in kindergarten, at the end of kindergarten, they all like write on like little pieces of paper for graduation. What do they want to be when they grow up? So this really resonates with me. And this is where I believe it starts, because these are when the impressions are made. I will tell you, in her private school, small kindergarten class, every girl they wanted to be a teacher or a mom, like on there. And the boys had a lot of other variety of ideas of what they wanted to do, anything from a firefighter to a policeman to a gamer, whatever. Like, there was just so much variety. And
Mm.
there were these common stereotypes or classic types that the girls seem to be leaning towards. Now, I'm not saying that the school is shepherding this thought, but I do think from just a common society standpoint, there are classic roles that women play that are very important in the world, and those should not go away, but they are classically driven through a more female gender related type of a draw. And I think in order for us to really break up and for STEM to not be a STEM issue anymore, where you have just as many women as men, I believe as it starts in kindergarten and first grade and second grade classrooms, where math and science is equally important to the girl as it is to the boy in the class. And
Mhm.
I think certain areas and certain schools and certain school districts might do it better than others. I don't think anyone has a evil agenda, if you will, but I do think that it starts with making impressions around opportunities that don't carry a gender bias as early as kindergarten and first grade.
That's very well said, and I really appreciate your perspective on these things. Along with that, there's a few other things you mentioned when we were on our prep call that I just thought were very unique and interesting things to dig into with you. One of the kind of the more, maybe someone would say, trivial ones, but I still think it captured my attention, is you mentioned that there's never a good time or a bad time to go on vacation. When it comes to the struggle of, like, finding the perfect time to be away, could you expand on why you feel it's never good, it's never bad, or could you maybe share a
Mhm.
personal experience
Mm.
that kind of relates to this?
It's like a love-hate schizophrenic relationship with vacation and work, and I think all of us probably can resonate with certain aspects of what I'm gonna say, hopefully, but, it's, if I go on vacation and they don't need me, I'm not relevant. Like, do they, right? Like, so you have that kind of, like, thing in your ear, and it's like, gosh, they need me. Then if they don't need me, what does
You
that
almost
mean?
want things to be on fire if you're
Right.
gone.
Well, there is that notion of like, well, I have all like I have there's a reason I'm in my role and I must have the answer, so they're
Mhm.
gonna need me. And if they don't need me, am I relevant? But honestly, like it's more, you know, in my older years, I would say I have learned that unplugging and recharging my batteries and being present with certain responsibilities I have outside of work become very, very important. And I've actually found that when I can do that, I'm a better person at work and I'm a better person at home, which then creates such a better environment and life in both facets. um, there's never a good time to go on vacation, because the work is always there. And so
Mhm.
it really requires some a good team and healthy work environment where people got your back. And that feels good. Like, hey, I'm gonna, I'm giving you some lead time. I'm gonna be out. Here are the 5 things that might blow up. And if they do, call me. But if not, here are some other things that are happening where people can help us. And then you secure those bonds of help with people. And that feels good. And then you return the favor when those people go on vacation and get their back. That's where it's like it creates a certain overhead of the work's always there. It's like a soap opera. I'm gone and work has been going on and it's still there. And here we are. But there's never a good time to go on vacation, and there's always a great time to go on vacation, and the great part is when you need to take a break, you're recognizing your energy reserves are probably being depleted, and so in order for you
Mhm.
to show up with your best self at work, sometimes you gotta go pay attention to yourself in different ways so that way you can rebuild and re-energize, so you can give it your most best work when you come back. I think where I've made mistakes along the way, I said I've learned this in my older years, but where I've made mistakes along the way, honestly, is I've been too accessible when I've been out of office as I've grown up in my career, where one could argue some of those vacations or times I wasn't 100% present at work and I wasn't 100%
Mm.
present on those vacations. So my personal life and my professional life didn't get the best of me in either situation. So if I create the right healthy boundaries and give myself the time that I need on vacation, then I can create a better situation in my personal life. And then when I come back to work, I can give my best self to work again because I'm fulfilled and I'm re-energized. So that's kind of like my little tidbit on vacation.
I love that. I think it's such a great perspective, and it's almost comforting to think of it that way in the sense that if you try and do both or take a lukewarm approach, you're really not benefiting anybody. Well, so I want to round us out with some kind of more quicker questions for you, and I don't know if you'll have answers to these off the top of your head, but we'll see here. We'll see what you got for me. What's one piece of advice you wish you had received earlier in your career?
Or the earliest part of my career, based on how I feel like I am successful now versus what could have accelerated some of my success in the early years that I didn't know. I would say don't underestimate the value of relationships and the role that you play in making a first impression with people.
Mm.
Um, I think and what I wasn't reckless or anything, but I was very transactional in my early years as a young pup, right? Like, "Hey, we gotta get this job done. Let's go. Okay." Like, I'm a doer, execute, and I didn't appreciate, relationships. I didn't appreciate connections, and really the world is small, and companies that seem big end up over time feeling small. And where you work is some aspect of a family, and if you maintain and work only in a very transactional type of environment, or you create only transactional type of relationships, I think that you maintain a certain surface that is not very meaningful, and people, I don't think people will necessarily be allergic to you, but you don't create a certain health of with relationships and team with people where you could go faster. So you can create more, you can do more, you can get help, you can provide help when you make more meaningful connections and you see past the transactional nature of what work is. I think that's very magical. And I think in order for us to do more with less, we need more magic. And with more magic, that means we appreciate people and we respect the relationships that we have with people that we work with.
Well said. Does something stand out to you? You know, maybe a personal habit, a personal routine that you've partaken in over the years that you might contribute some of your success either as a leader or as as a successful worker in the tech industry too. Does anything stand out like that?
The first thing that I go to is, I get flooded at times. So, work can be intense, how you use your brain, the stresses, the pressure of people needing to have all the answers, maybe never having the answers on a certain day when you need to have answers. I can get flooded, brain flex, brain's a muscle. And so it flexes a lot. And so one of the things that I've grown up over time that I feel like has helped me keep a better center and balance so I can be effective is, you know, I I exercise. I when I feel like, and I'm not saying like everyone needs to hit the gym in order to be successful in engineering leadership, right? I'm talking,
Hmm.
there are periods of time where I don't go to the gym, but I walk outside, I move my body, I get fresh air.
Sure.
That's the biggest thing that I've done. I wasn't doing that in my 20s. That's what old ladies did. They went outside for a walk. No, like I should have been in my 20s. I probably could have been way more effective and had more mental clarity in my 20s if I was getting out more, getting fresh air, recharging, and maybe, moving my body a bit more to counter and balance all the brain flexing that I'm doing in my job. I feel like
Mm,
that kind of helps center us, and then we can reestablish a better approach and have more clarity. And so we can focus better and our brains are optimized better if we can just kind of flush it. I wish I would have done
yeah.
more of that in my 20s. I do that now, and that's the one thing that stands out to me.
That makes a lot of sense, especially for an industry where it's so easy to get cooped up and to get locked in to your screen, to your seat,
Yeah.
right? One problem after another. And yeah, I know personally, I kind of have that thought in my head that's always, it's kind of like, well, in 30 minutes is when I'm going to take my break and I'm going to get up and I'm going to move around and I'm going to get the blood flowing. And that 30 minutes never really elapses. It's always the next and the next and the next. So that makes a lot of sense to me. Um, in terms of, and I don't even know if this needs to relate to tech leadership, but just curious, Lisa, like what's got your attention right now? What are you reading? What are you listening to? What are you watching?
Oh, I like audibles. So when I told you I walk or I run, and to kind of rebalance. So about a month ago, I read somewhere that I listen to a lot of music. I love music. So that's like music and running or music and hiking and walking. And I read somewhere around, like kind of podcasts and like just trying to stimulate your brain in a different way that's not on work topics. I'm like, gosh, I listen to music. I'm kind of like, if I go out for a run for 1 hour, I could get through a decent size of a book. So I
Hmm.
requested membership to Audibles, and I've crushed in 4 weeks 4 books through running or hiking or,
Wow.
yeah, it just exercising. So I've shifted. So the 2 recent books that I just finished, in the last 2 weeks is Tara Brach's Radical Acceptance, amazing book, and The Source by Tara Swartz. So the Source is a book. It's like neuroplasty. She's a PhD. How does the brain work? I'm like really into like, you remember I
Mm.
told you I'm like, gosh, I feel like I'd be a better engineering leader if I just had a psych major.
Right.
So studying people, understanding people, trying to help people become better. It's not just the work, but it's also understanding how people think and what's important to them. And so I'm really in this kind of new zone of kind of self-help books as it relates to learning about how the brain works. So Radical Acceptance is another one around how how our brains and our minds run. I just got a new book, so I'm going to be starting a new book, and this is actually a paperback. Women, Language, and Power: Giving Voice to Our Ambition. This was actually right, and it's by Susanna Baldwin. It was actually recommended by an SVP mentor of mine in the industry, and it's a book about how the female voice from a leadership standpoint, how our voice can create ambitious movements around us in an elegant way. So I'm reading that one next.
And you said this is somewhat like 'cause you're normally a music person, so having switched over to Audible is fairly recent for you. You said
Yes. Yeah, I'm a
it.
big, like, I'm in Seattle, so I'm a Nirvana, Pearl Jam,
Gotcha.
I'm grunge, and so I've been listening. Those are my musical escapes, but now I've shifted to audibles because I'm trying to figure a few things out that I don't have answers to.
That's so cool. I love that. I want to just sit here and chat with you for another 3 hours, but I've already been very, very selfish of your time. So I think I'll let you go, and just want to say thank you so much for spending your valuable time with us. It's been a pleasure to hear like your insights, the things you've gathered throughout your impressive career. I'm really grateful that you took the time to speak with us today. So thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Chris, so much for everything that you're doing and interviewing different leaders in the industry and creating pathways for people to hear from others so that they can learn and think and iterate. I think what you're doing is super awesome, and I'm happy to support you. Good luck with everything.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Well, thank you everybody for listening too. That'll do it for us today from the Den of Wolft. Stay tuned for more inspiring conversations with terrific engineering leaders like Lisa. And until next time, I'm Christopher Cohen from QA Wolf, and we'll see you then.